Rotarians, guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker, Squadron Leader Ldr Saber. Adam is obviously a pilot with the Royal Australian Air Force, specifically 11 Squadron. Now, I just want to quickly do a bit of context setting and then it's on with the show. We tend to focus on shipbuilding here because that's been such a big focus of the defence industry. There are three legs to the defence sector. Army's another, which you well know, and Air Force obviously is another critical one. And it's easy to forget the fact that that has a very large presence. Now, while we're busy building submarines down at Osborne and maintaining them, there's a section of the Air Force that's determined to sink them. And that's what we're talking about today. Number 92 Wing is Australia's maritime defence organisation out at RAAF Edinburgh. And it comprises two front-end squadrons, number 10 and number 11. Both have an auspicious history, which dates back to the Second World War. I'm not going to dwell on that today. The point of all this is, if you spend any time catching flights in and out of Adelaide, every now and then you'll see a grey aircraft with 4 engines and a big long pointy tail. That's the P-3C Orion, which has to be one of the best defence investments Australia's ever made. They've been in the air for nearly 50 years, but they're about to be, or in the process of being phased out and replaced by the P-8 Poseidon. Sorry, I had a mental blank there. And that process is now taking place. So I've asked 92 Wing to tell us a bit about it, and Adam is the anointed representative. He's a very well-credentialed spokesperson, graduating from his pilot's course in 2006. He spent a considerable time on exchange in Canada and is now part of the process with 11 Squadron, bringing the P-8 into service. So, Adam, tell us all about it. Thank you.
How's that sound? Thanks very much, Steve. Is that all right? Everyone can hear me well? All right, excellent. Like Steve said, I'm going to talk to you today about the RAAF's latest acquisition, the Maritime Patrol Aircraft, the P-8 Poseidon, which you see on the board. My current position is at 11 Squadron as one of the flight commanders and the Aviation Safety Officer. So I'm going to talk about today. So it's fairly generic. I'm not going to go into too many specifics simply because of time. I'm more than happy to take questions at the end, but if you could hold them until the end, that would be appreciated. However, as is ADF's general ability, I might end up talking about Air Force lexicon and start using acronyms. If that happens, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and stop me and explain what I'm talking about. So, capability requirement, I'm not going to read that to you, but in 2013 the Defence White Paper identified that the Poseidon and the Triton aircraft will be selected as the family of systems to replace the venerable P-3, which, as Steve mentioned, has been in service for a long time. The P-3 Charlie variant, which is now the AP-3, was first introduced in sort of the early 80s, so that airframe now is nearing 40 years old. The key points on there, you can see highlighted in red, so broad area maritime surveillance, anti-submarine warfare, and long-range, long-endurance response. So the requirement for us was to have a large aeroplane that had a long range, as opposed to a rotary wing asset or something smaller, which is obviously going to be cheaper, probably more flexible in the short term, but wouldn't offer us the requirements that the government has outlined. You can see at the bottom, that area in green, that's Australia's search and rescue region, which essentially goes from New Zealand to halfway to Africa, obviously a massive swath of the Earth's surface, and it's our requirement to be able to cover that as a government in case any vessel or aircraft requires coverage. And no doubt everyone is well aware of what happened with MH370. The P-3 and the US Navy P-8s were heavily involved in that search. In addition to the government requirement, I've just pulled this out of the 2016 white paper, outlining why maritime is so important to Australia. We're obviously a maritime nation surrounded by water, and a huge amount of our trade and our lifelines are provided via oceanic means. So you can see, all those red lines is global trade, and a huge amount is happening in our backyard, just to our north in the South China Sea, the Malacca Straits, and the northern part of the Indian Ocean. So we obviously have a very important interest in what goes on up there. Now quickly, I'm just going to run through some of the roles. I don't mean to insult anyone's intelligence if you're aware of these, but this is a bunch of the roles that the P3 on the Maritime Patrol Aircraft subset is required to perform. At the top, I've highlighted high-end warfighting, and these two roles here are the bread and butter, I suppose, of what we do in the P3 and now the P8. Anti-submarine warfare. If anyone has read any of the great books about it, it's a very complicated game of cat and mouse involving a submarine that doesn't want to be found, which is extremely difficult to find, and an aircraft or multiple aeroplanes. Essentially what that involves, by and large, is dropping a sonobuoy, which is a microphone on a float, into the ocean, and pretty much listening out for the sound bearings created by a submarine moving through the water. As technology has progressed, those sonobuoys have become more advanced, and recent ones have got a GPS tracker on them, so we can actually locate exactly where they are in the ocean. But essentially, that skill set is something that's been around for a long time on the P8 and all its predecessors. Anti-service warfare is our other high-end warfighting skill, which is essentially us requiring or being necessitated to monitor and perhaps sink offensive surface vessels. Now we do this using a multitude of sensors and offensive weapons, particularly the AGM-84 Harpoon, which I'll cover a little bit later, which is an anti-shipping missile. These two roles are quite demanding on a crew, and as you can imagine, in a real-world war scenario, they become merged and become incredibly complex, because while we're out there trying to, find a submarine, they're trying to shoot at us, and it becomes a little bit more problematic as opposed to just flying around in the ocean unopposed. Some of the other core roles, and by no means less important, maritime intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. And this is one of the most important roles that we perform in the real world right now. So Operation Resolute, which contributes to our maritime awareness, illegal fisheries, illegal immigration, and monitoring our borders, that's a huge part of what we do. That skill set is drawn a little bit from the anti-surface warfare role, which essentially is using the same multitude of sensors to work out who's who in the zoo, who's on the ocean, where they're going, what they're doing, what's on their vessel, and who they work for. Overland intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. So the P3 has a long history in the Middle East of that. You may well be aware of Operation Slipper and Catalyst, which is Iraq and Afghanistan, and working with our troops and friendly forces on the ground. And that is essentially the P3 at the time, being able to use its electro-optics turret, which is basically a great big spy camera in the front of the aeroplane, looking at things on the ground and then communicating in real time to friendly forces. So this essentially allows them to have an eye in the sky, real-time real-time level 1 analysis of what they're seeing, and they can position us as required. Now that role is partially being replaced by unmanned systems, but there is a limitation on unmanned system, which requires you still require a human in the loop. So having a drone, as we like to call them, doesn't mean that you can analyse what it is you're looking at. You still need to have humans in the loop. So the advantage of a manned system is down the back of a P3 or a P8, there's 5 or 6 operators all looking at the same thing and analysing it in lots of different spectrums. That's quite an important skill set. And last but by no means least, search and rescue. Now, search and rescue is a very topical role. Obviously, that's very important for us to maintain in our search and rescue region, and it's one of the things that we perform frequently. As I alluded to before, the ADF performs the long range search and rescue roles for the government. We have several contractors and shorter range platforms, rotary platforms that can do close-in search and rescue, but once we start moving outside the economic exclusion zone and out into the Indian Ocean in particular, there's not many assets that can actually make it out there. Noting, of course, that we are a fixed-wing asset, and the R part of search and rescue is extremely problematic from an aeroplane. So we typically will, we can find the survivors, drop them stores, and then vector in shipping to actually affect the rescue component. So essentially, those are the roles that we perform, and each of those roles have got some sub-roles, which I won't go into today. So quickly, the P3 versus the P8. P3 obviously in the foreground, and that was taken last year. End of 2016, when our first P8 arrived in Australia. So on paper, they look relatively similar. They both have an electronically steered radar, which allows them to detect surface and airborne contacts and classify them to a certain degree. They both have an acoustics processor with which they can use the information gathered from sonobuoys. Although up there I've noted 64 versus 16, so the P8 has a much greater capacity of sonobuoys that it can monitor and some more advanced technologies there. Electronic support, so that allows us on board the aircraft to absorb emissions, whether it be from communications, radar or whatever, and analyse that in real time and essentially work out who it is that's looking at us or talking to us. So ESM is extremely important and it allows us to perform high-end roles like anti-surface warfare. Electro-optics, which I spoke about earlier, that's the spy camera at the front of or the back of the airplane on the P-8. It can be in 2 different positions and that's got a bunch of different lenses, so you can by day, by night, infrared, and you can have laser designators and the like all fitted to those. The magnetic anomaly detector, now like Steve mentioned, you might have seen P3s flying around with that weird stinger thing on the back. That's what the MAD is, that little boom out the back of it. That is essentially like a giant magnet, for want of a better term. So it detects the disturbance in the Earth's magnetic field caused by a giant metal object like a submarine under the water. So if we fly over a submarine that's submerged, and the MAD is on, essentially you can go, well, there's something under there, and now we're going to work out what that is. You'll notice the P-8 doesn't have a long stinger. It's got a tiny little cute thing. That's not a magnetic anomaly detector. It's not actually fitted to the P-8, and that's because of the design of the aircraft. It's not optimised to be down at low level. They both carry a torpedo. The P-8 has the Mark 54, which is a much more advanced variant of the Mark 46, the Harpoon, which is an anti-shipping missile, and then the SC rescue kit on the P3 and the Unipack 2 on the P-8, which is against essentially a bunch of RAAFs that we can drop to survivors. Now, the P3, great airplane. It's been the workhorse of the ADF for quite some time. Designed in the Cold War to work alone and unafraid ahead of a force, working for a surface force to detect, deter and destroy submarines. Where we've moved to now is more of a family of systems, which involves not only the P-8, but the MQ-4 Triton and its associated support infrastructure. And what this allows us to do is network much better network more effectively in with the rest of the ADF's 5th generation assets. So you can see, this part of the spectrum here over to the right. So ISR support to the government. So that's a permissive environment, long range, long persistence, maritime ISR, essentially monitoring our approaches. That's something the Triton can do because it can stay airborne for up to 24 hours at a time. It's got a huge altitude. Still requires humans in the loop to analyse that data, but it can stay where it needs to for a long time. As we start to move towards the left-hand side of the spectrum, anti-surface warfare, the Triton can still contribute to that picture, but increasingly it becomes the role of a manned platform because the Triton can't shoot and it doesn't have people on board. And then as we move to the left-hand side, anti-submarine, anti-surface warfare and search and rescue, that's where the P-8's bread and butter is. So sort of high speed, high response, lower endurance, and a lot more effective. So these 2 systems are complementary, which is why it's actually a family of systems we're buying and it's not just one platform. Now, how does the P-8 differ from a 737? Because it certainly looks very similar. Just a few things. So the airframe is based on a 737-800 body and a 737-900 wings. You'll notice the wingtips are swept back as opposed to swept up on a commercial airliner, and this is partly to do with our sensors. The airframe is also extremely heavily reinforced in a lot of areas. So you can see just down here, this is the aft weapons bay. So obviously not many civilian airplanes have a weapons bay. That required a lot of modification to fit that in there. The wiring, it's got wiring all through the airframe to cater for future systems, and this is one of the big reasons why the P-8 is such a good decision. Okay, where it's at right now in capability is roughly on par with the P-3, but it's designed for future infrastructure growth. So all of the weapons pylons, all of the systems down the back are designed for essentially plug and play. Once a new piece of kit comes along, pull the old piece of kit out, new piece of kit in, deal with the software, off you go, and the capability begins to increase. Hydraulics, we needed to modify that to open and close the weapons bay and the air-to-air refuelling door, which is this thing up here. So if you have a chance to see a P-8, there's this weird pattern on the roof just above the cockpit. That's so we can fly it behind another aeroplane and plug into an air-to-air refuelling boom, which is quite exciting. Crew oxygen, a bit different on this thing, so you don't get your emergency masks drop down. You actually have full integrated comms, communications and oxygen, so the crew can actually operate for an extended period on oxygen. Fire detection and suppression is a big one, so there's a huge amount of electronic bays underneath the aeroplane, so it's got an automatic detection and suppression system in all the different dry bays, where obviously a commercial aircraft has just got people's suitcases and hopefully no lithium batteries exploding. The fuel, So we have a huge amount of extra fuel. So there's forward and aft auxiliary fuel tanks, and allows us to take about 72,000 pounds of fuel, so about 32 odd tonnes of gas. Gives us a great endurance, which actually pushes our takeoff weight up to nearly 190,000 pounds, which is about 40,000 pounds heavier than the next heaviest Boeing variant. Why am I talking in pounds? Since we're using the metric system in the 21st century, the US Navy use pounds, so we gladly get to use pounds. Weapons, I'll sort of cover those a little bit. Obviously there's a bunch of weapons pylons on the aircraft, so there's 2 on each wing, 5 in the weapons bay, and there's 2 body pylons as well. One of the good things about the weapons system is it's designed to take any mil standard weapon, so the data bus and the bruise or the bomb rack units are all designed with commonality in mind. So at the moment we can use torpedoes and harpoons, but if somebody decided that we wanted to drop some kind of low yield JDAM weapon, once they've done some separation testing, it's essentially as simple as updating the software and plugging it onto the aeroplane. So it's designed for a lot of future growth. It's not limited in what it can and can't carry. It's got self-defense, electro-optics, and a radio suite. So the radio suite, if you happen to park next to one on the ramp at Adelaide Airport, kind of looks like a sea urchin. There's antennas everywhere, and that allows us to talk anywhere from the high-frequency spectrum all the way through to beyond line of sight SATCOM, and any iteration in between in both secure and non-secure comms. So the radio panel is particularly complicated, which is why we get radio communicators and not pilots to do it, because it's too hard for me to use. And the thrust. So about 55,000 pounds of thrust on this thing, which when you're at lightweights is it's quite a change from the P3. This thing certainly performs very well. Some of the other factors. So the outer ring is the P3, the P8, and the inner ring is the P3. So for the numbers buffs, our cruising speed is about 450 knots, or about 800 kilometres an hour, whereas the P3 was about 330 knots, which is 600 kilometres an hour thereabouts, giving us about a 33% speed increase going to on station. When we're down at low level, we're burning more gas than a P3 was burning, noting that we weren't designed to be at low level. However, the fact that we can carry an extra 12 or 15,000 pounds of fuel allows us to have a similar endurance on station and then our range back. So the net effect to that is a bit of a range increase over what the P3 can do. Operating from all these bases here, Learmonth is in orange because that's one of our forward operating bases. It's not a fully manned base, although we are doing a fair bit of flying out of there. And like I said in the header, that's the unrefueled range. So the fact that we can refuel this airborne essentially limits the range to the cruise limit. So this thing can fly essentially until the people can't stay awake or have run out of coffee, essentially. Some of the weapons and stores. So I've spoken about the harpoon and the torpedo. These are the weapons bays here. And guess what I want to highlight here is the acoustic stores. So this little diagram here is what it looks like in the back of the aeroplane, and those 3 Dalek looking things are rotary sonobuoy launchers. So they can carry 10 sonobuoys at a time, and they essentially automatically will deploy sonobuoys depending on what the tactical coordinator's sonobuoy pattern in the water wants to look like. So we can fly around and spit, we can rain steel into the water in an attempt to try and catch an extremely elusive submarine. It doesn't mean it's any easier. It's still a very complicated job, but that allows us to get a lot more into the water. And this is what I was talking about a little bit earlier, so the network system. So what we're buying, or we've committed to with the P8 is not just the P8, it's the P8 and the Triton combined in a network system. So, the MQ4 and the P8 Poseidon, the mission support system and the launch and recovery components, this is the system we're buying. It's not just a platform on its own. And this allows us to integrate with all of the 5th gen parts of the ADF. Now, we spoke about shipbuilding a little bit earlier. The air warfare destroyer, the Hobart class, the Canberra class, the upgraded Anzac frigates, all of those platforms are designed to talk to us on the same link networks, on the same comms networks. So the ability for us to integrate into the 5th generation Air Force and ADF as a whole is massively increased by the advent of the introduction of the P8 and the Triton. So some training devices. So this is the infrastructure that's going into Edinburgh. So the operational flight trainer, which essentially is like an airliner, full motion simulator for the flight deck. So it gets up on jacks, it moves around. It's extremely realistic. And if you've been in there for more than about 5 minutes, you would swear you're in the real aeroplane. It's particularly important for us because it allows us to simulate all of the things that you can't simulate in the real airplane, such as engine failures, fires, battle damage, very complex airspace environments that we can't necessarily replicate in the real world. Combined with that is a weapons and tactics trainer, which is this thing here. That looks like the P-8 back like full scale. So you walk down there, you would think you're in the back of the airplane, and that's for the back-end crew. That is extremely realistic as well. And these two things can combine to a weapons and systems trainer, or a WST, which allows us to simulate in real time the front end up on motion, flying the airplane, the back end talking, doing all their comp stuff, and out the back is a training team able to simulate, essentially where your imagination goes is the limit of what you can simulate, and it's just absolutely fantastic to see these things in action. Our simulator should be up and running next week in Adelaide, and it's quite amazing to see them. It's going to sound like a funny downside. One of the funny downsides of the P-8 is how reliable it is. So maintenance don't often get to do things like engine changes, pull parts out of the airplane and go, this is broken. So as part of that, they've got ordnance load trainers and ordnance and maintenance trainers. So you can see these here, a full mock-up of a 737 that they can pull an engine on and off and actually simulate doing the work of pulling parts off the aircraft, because we don't get to do that that frequently because the airplane just doesn't break. So this is another important part of our training system, and all this is going into Edinburgh as we speak. The transition plan. So we started embedding people into VP30, which is the United States Navy training squadron, in around about 2014, and that was all trades. So pilots, air combat officers, acoustic and non-acoustic operators and maintenance personnel to create a core of corporate knowledge, I suppose, on this aeroplane. From that point, in mid-2016, we sent 2 crews worth of people across to start learning, essentially integrate into the US Navy system and become our first 2 crews on P-8. And then from that point onwards, every 6 months, we've essentially sent 2 air crews worth, plus an associated maintenance footprint across the VP30 to train in the US, in Jacksonville in Florida, which is where their major training base is. And we were doing this simply because of the time frame it was required to get Boeing, the Boeing installation of our synthetic devices, which was, that was something that you can't just drag on in a hurry. Like, these are extremely complicated and expensive sims, so we couldn't get them brought forward. The crew that's over there now will be our last crew that trains in the States, and from mid this year we'll be doing Australian-based conversion training, and from the start of next year we'll start running ab initio training. So at the moment, everyone that's gone on to P-8 essentially has been on a P-3 or something previous to that. So we're sort of, I guess, transitioning people. From next year, it's going to be brand new pilots, navigators, sensor operators straight out of their ab initio course. And as you can see in there, end of 2016, that was when 11 Squadron P-3 operations ended, and then the squadron essentially flipped over, and our first 2 crews and first aircraft started on P-8. What it's going to look like, sorry, there's a typo up there. So the previous system had 6 crews on P-3. We drew that down to at the end of 2016. At the moment, we're at 4 crews. We'll be about 6 crews in the middle of this year. And our mature system, 11 Squadron, is planned to be 12 crews plus the associated maintenance footprint. So in summary, why did we replace the P-3? Obviously a very capable aeroplane. The P-3 had pretty much reached the apogee of where it was going to be able to go in terms of upgrade. We were running out of real estate on the aircraft. It was having power supply issues, so obviously brand new technologies require very smooth controlled electronics. The P-3 was not necessarily able to deliver that. It's also aging, so it's older than me, which is cool. It's a good testament to its reliability and its rugged nature, but it is essentially required replacement. Our major ally alignment. So we require obviously good interoperability with the US Navy, and they operate this. They're planning to get up to 120 airframes and 12 line squadrons of about 12 crews. So dwarfs us in comparison, but we need to be able to operate with them effectively. And we're also a cooperative partner, which allows us to steer the program. So the difference between this and something that we bought off the shelf, you buy an off-the-shelf product, you pretty much get, this is what you get. For us, we've got people embedded in the US Navy development program now and for a long time in the future, which allowed us to steer things like the search and rescue stores. So the US Navy don't do search and rescue, the US Coast Guard do it. So they didn't have a requirement for search and rescue kits, we did. So that allowed us to get into the project at that point and develop it. A lot of commonalities. So our E7 Airborne Early Warning Control airplane, that's the 737 variant. Our business jet's the 737 variant. And Qantas and Virgin and Jetstar, the 737s around Australia. It allows a lot more redundancy flying domestically in case we land somewhere we're not planning on landing. Future compatibility and growth, I spoke about that already. So there's a lot of design features in this airplane that allow us to take it to the next level in terms of technology. There's a lot more bolt-on kits available, and it's designed for what's coming down the road. It might not have even been designed yet, but it's ready to go when someone comes up with a brainwave of some magic sensor that can detect a submarine all the time. It's already a semi-mature system. So the US, like I said, the US already operate this thing. It's a lower risk platform as opposed to something like the Sea Hercules or the Super P3 or the Saab Swordfish, which are all sort of tentative maritime patrol aircraft replacements, but they're not operational. So there's a lot of risk that comes with choosing something off the plan, whereas this thing has already been operating. And the most suitable for the RAAF. So our Plan Jericho, which is taking us towards a 5th generation Air Force and ADF, requires a lot of our platforms to integrate with each other. The P-8 was pretty much ready to go to integrate with everything we already had and take us into the future. And that's what it is.
Fantastic. Beautifully timed too. We've got time for some questions. So, Mr. Hunter.
Sir, you talk about so much pounds of fuel. How many English or Australian gallons is that in the plane? We understand volume, not pounds.
Are you going to make me do maths in front of everybody? So 72,000 pounds of fuel is around about 32, well, it's about 0.7 litres to a pound, 0.7 litres to a kilo. So what are we talking? 40-ish thousand litres. It's a lot of fuel.
There's a very famous, embarrassing story about a mix-up between metric and imperial, and it involved an Air Canada flight. And they loaded it with litres instead of pounds of fuel, and it ended badly. The plane got down, but only just. Adrian, sorry.
You've explained to us how you've compensated the extra fuel consumption with added fuel on board, obviously, on the plane. What about low-speed maneuverability in comparison with the P3 in those search and rescue operations where you might need to stick to a closed area, maybe at low speed? Is it comparable as well, or with the propellers versus the jet, you can fly slower and you can maneuver a bit slower? I've got no idea.
No, that's a great question. In terms of manoeuvrability at low level, it's actually, the P8's excellent. When we're extremely heavy, our minimum speed is a fair bit higher than what the P3 used to be. But if we require slower speed, we'll actually start taking a little bit of flap. So our leading edge devices will come down and we can fly at a comparable speed to the P3. In terms of low level endurance, we're burning around about 6,000 pounds an hour. So, sorry, I can't give that in litres. 6,000 pounds an hour, whereas the P3 used to burn around about 4,500 pounds an hour. And that's simply because this airplane was designed to be a mid to higher level anti-submarine warfare airplane, and all the sensors are optimised for that. But like I said, we've got a lot more fuel, so it offsets relatively well.
There's no such thing as a free lunch. Stephen.
Given that a lot of your tours are to the north of Australia, I wonder if you'd say something about the strategic logic of the Edinburgh base for this fleet.
That's another great question. I think that was probably designed or decided upon well before I joined the RAAF. But I would say, on my perspective, it is actually well positioned to cover our entire region. So from Edinburgh, you can reach anywhere in Australia in around about 3 hours, depending on what it is you need to do, which means it's relatively centrally positioned, and that allows us to cover off our range of roles. Obviously, it would feel more logical to put us right at the north, since we do a lot of flying up there, but we obviously have to cover the south part of Australia, the Southern Ocean, so the Tony Bullimore rescue and things like that, we're involved in those kind of things. So again, I wouldn't want to speak on government policy because I don't know, but I would say that is a reasonable reason why it's kept in South Australia.
There's another very good reason. Darwin got bombed in World War II, Edinburgh didn't.
What do you say? Squadron Leader, I don't know if I missed it, but how many aircraft in the squadron, or will there be when it's complete? And a second question, how seriously are you concerned about drones causing difficulties with your jet intakes? Domestic drone aircraft.
All right, excellent. So in answer to the first question, the white paper is committed to 8, with most likely up to 12 P-8s, with the potential to go up to 15 in the mature system, and up to 7 Tritons, which is sort of what we've got as our mature system. At the moment, we've got 6 online, and they're delivering them approximately once every 4 months as they roll out of the factory in Boeing. Your second question, quite concerned. A drone is a bit like hitting a large bird. In the P3, I've had a lot of birds in P3s, and that thing was pretty bulletproof. This thing is not so much bulletproof, particularly the way the intakes look. So we're particularly cognizant of areas where drones might be operating, and at the moment there's a fair bit of push with Air Services Australia to manage people's use of drones and the altitudes and the areas within which they can use them. So yeah, very concerned. Given the proliferation of them and how cheap they are, it could become a factor. Right now, we haven't been hitting drones, but I don't think that's not going to be the case, or going to stay the case forever.
One more, and we'll try and sneak the last one in, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you. As a chartered accountant, also someone who works in taxation, I've got to ask you a couple of questions. What do these things cost in the Air Force House, as in fully equipped, per unit? And also tell us about the cost of the drones. And then coupled with that is what happens to the Orions. I have been in an Orion, so I know they're quite a big aircraft, but I know they're very dated, so I think the changes are really very timely. But if you could just comment on those, thank you.
Okay, so it's actually a very difficult question to put an exact figure on this aeroplane. The latest figures I had from Boeing, the off-the-shelf cost was around about 235 million US. So that fits in approximately with what our budget allocation of around about $4 billion for the project was. So about 300 million Australian per airframe. But that's a bit of a deceptive number. I mean, as you know, you can make accounting numbers say lots of different things depending on what you need. That figure is not airframes. That figure is the system. So with that system comes a bunch of maintenance support. It comes the synthetic devices and a lot of other life support things. So I'd be hesitant to say that's what they cost, but approximately 300 million AUD per airframe. So chump change really.
One more, Jeff Pitt, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Quick question, or it's not quick. The Trident, I assume, is non-combative in that it can't actually deploy weapons. I was fortunate enough to go to Waddington in England, the RAAF base there, which is where the drones fly from, which are the combative drones. And would you comment on the fact that the operators there talked to me and said how good it was that and given that there's been a movie about this as well, that with a drone it's really good because you're operating way away from the combat zone, and it allows you to refer upwards if you are going to release a weapon which can cause major problems, and that they found that as quite a good thing to have. How do you feel about that?
That you could refer upwards?
Yes.
So noting that we haven't been in a significant conflict on the P3, there's no scope for us to decide at our level if we're going to release a weapon. Obviously, if we're out ahead of a force and we have a torpedo in the weapons bay, that could be the trigger for something more serious. So it almost always is going to be referred upwards. I guess having a remote location allows that refer upwards to happen quicker, but it's still something that's going to be in our loop.
Yeah, the interesting thing about, because Waddington was where most of the Lancasters and that went in World War II, and of course they just dropped bombs, and the RAAF people were talking about the fact that they found this a much more comforting way to actually fight a war, that they are obviously flying drones over various combat zones at the moment, and they found it was better to be able to refer upwards, whereas I guess the issue that arose in the film, I think it was Eye in the Sky, was by referring upwards, the politicians got involved, and we ended up with serious delays in making decisions. So, It's a big issue for the future, I would have thought.
Absolutely.
There's no such thing as a free lunch. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join with me in thanking Adam for an engaging and very informative presentation. And